So just a quick intro. So we really did study what Edit mentioned with the integration methods of ethnic minorities in Hungary, but I'm particularly going to be focusing on Romani people and education. And this is one of the photos we took after working with some kids at education, well not education, but a after-school program that focused on Romani students. So you can see a little bit of us there integrating with them or hanging out with them. So to start, and this is going to be a little bit redundant what Edit said, but what we did in Hungary for the duration of 3 weeks is that we went there to study 3 ethnic minority groups, primarily the Romani people, the Chinese community, and the refugee population there. And we focused in the northeastern region of Hungary, which you can see Miskolc up top, as well as Budapest, which is the central capital, and Pécs in southwestern Hungary. And so when we came to realize that integration projects mostly focused around 2 principles, which was housing development and education. And so for the sake of time, as this will be a series of presentations, I'm going to focus primarily on education and the Romani people and introducing them. And so for the presentation outline, what I'm going to be focusing is introducing the Romani, who they are, historical backgrounds, discrimination they face, and social inequalities, and discuss a specific education project that we focus there, and as well as suggest my personal improvements to how we can tweak this education project to make it more efficient. So we can get started by giving a brief overview of the Romani population and distribution in Hungary. But first, for some information that may not be well known on the Romani population is that there's a general consensus among scholars that they migrated from northern India to Eastern Europe approximately 700 years ago. And they've been settling through a variety of widespread countries throughout Europe and the Americas for centuries, essentially. But this brings to light this romanticized image that we have of the Romani as travelers, and this really creates a background identity based on representations of them that we have to keep in mind. But the significance here is that the Roma have been settled in Hungary for 500 years, so this is generations and generations and families that have lived here, but they still aren't fully accepted as part of the society, and they're still seen as the other within Hungarian society. And so to give some statistical data on the population of Hungary, as of 2011, the population census of Hungary was around 9.8 million, and they also stated that the Roma population was around 245,000. But once we met with the Romology department at the University of Pécs, we learned that these numbers are a little bit skewed because a more accurate estimate would be around 600,000 to 800,000. And this was largely because the Roma population has always notoriously been difficult to assess, partly because of systematic ways of collecting ethnic data, but as well as sometimes we find cases where Roma will tend to identify more of Hungarian identity, and they'll choose to leave their Roma identity behind to gain more opportunity. And this, a big thing that plays a part of choosing to identify fully as Hungarian is the level of integration you participate in, that you have achieved in society, as well as education levels. And the color of your skin actually plays a really big part, where if you have lighter skin, you can more easily be identified as Hungarian instead of Roma. And so again, people will choose to identify as Hungarian because they have more opportunities. So again, the number is more around 608,000 Roma in Hungary, which is around 8% of the population. And they are the largest ethnic minority in Hungary. And so this brings to light that there's this, well, not brings to light, but there are several subgroups of Roma in Hungary. So it's not just one homogeneous ethnic group. There are different ethnic groups within the ethnic group. But before I get into that, I wanted to mention that I think here in the US, with this map, the word gypsy has a negative connotation, or it's often seen as derogatory, but abroad, and especially in Hungary, this word is used interchangeably with Roma. And so many sources will use gypsies. So this is not meant in any negative way or derogatory terms, but nonetheless, the subgroups, three principal ethnic groups are the Roma Hungarian, which are the Romangro. Their language is extinct, but they're also seen as the most integrated into society because they are more associated with middle class, they are more educated, and they tend to live in more urban cities like Budapest and more popular cities like Miskolc up north. Next we have the Bolyai. The Bolyai, they tend to live in smaller communities. They've kept their original dialect. Live in small communities with like high unemployment rates as well. And the key distinguishing feature between them is that they have darker skin color. And because of this, they face a lot more discrimination. And lastly, we have the Vlach. The Vlach, they live throughout Hungary in smaller communities that keep in close contact with another. But they see themselves as the defenders of Roma culture because they've kept a lot of traditions and customs and practices. But this is important, and I want to identify these groups because although they are part of one ethnic minority, they also have a lot of conflicts with one another. And so identity politics becomes really, really important because instead of coming together as one ethnic minority to fight social inequalities, they are kind of redirecting their attention towards conflicts with one another. And so you ask, why do they need integration? Why are there projects? If they were to come together, what are the social inequalities they would be fighting? Essentially, there are many social and economic inequalities that arise from widespread discrimination. And this can be seen in employment, education, housing, cultural acceptance. And just to look at some statistics in employment, the Hungarian Statistical Central Office stated in 2016 that 39% of the working age Romani are employed compared to 69% of the employed of 69% employed non-Roma. So non-Roma, 69%. Okay. And so this inequality and this gap can also be seen in education, where 20% have completed secondary school, which is essentially high school, compared to 80% of non-Roma that have achieved high school education. And this housing, similar circumstances can also be seen in housing, where the vast majority of Roma live or have lived in rural areas where housing conditions are less developed than the general population. And so these communities also tend to be segregated and have lower living standards. And I have a really good example with a picture. And this is a picture I took in Miskolc, which is the northern region of Hungary. And this neighborhood is one of the segregated neighborhoods there that is working with a lot of housing development. And it has a really interesting story because segregated neighborhoods aren't immediately created as segregated neighborhoods, but they have been gradually over time. And so these houses were actually dachas at the time. Dachas, it's the Russian word, translates into like a lake house or weekend house, summer house, where people go to get away from the cities. And a characteristic in these dacha houses or weekend houses is that they didn't have any formal plumbing into them, so they didn't have any water, and this made them more affordable for lower income families to move into. And specifically the Roma families started moving in. And as more Roma families started moving in, this lowered the property value of the entire area, which made it even more affordable, so more and more Roma started moving into this area. And so essentially, gradually over time, this entire area became segregated community for Roma. But you see that these conditions for living, they're not sustainable for long term. Sometimes, we saw many cases, there were doors missing, windows, there was no insulation from the winter, no roads, and they had to go to the end of the street to collect their water through like a pumping device. And so these are some of the inequality gaps that are very significant. Like these are the physical ones, but also there's discrimination. And so this leads me to the next slide to see what are causing these gaps in social inequalities. But to understand what are causing these gaps is to we have to look at the history first, especially the origins of discrimination. And not to get too detailed into history, but we have to look at really where the changes started happening and discrimination emerged from. And so, not to take it too back, but I'm going to take it back to the 15th century, which is a few centuries ago. But this is really when the Roma started arriving to Europe. And even back here is where discrimination can be traced, because the Holy Roman Empire categorized the Roma as spies, and they should be extinct, and they shouldn't be here. And as well, there was legislature in almost every country, with the exclusion of Hungary, Russia, and Transylvania, to expel Roma from their countries. But this is really important because it created this this exclusion in their identity, and so they started living in the outskirts of cities. They weren't that integrated into society. They didn't associate with mainstream society, and so this has started creating this identity for them that they were, they didn't participate in mainstream society. They also didn't own land, and so this was very looked down upon because they didn't contribute anything. It was that, Hungarians living didn't see them as contributing anything. So this was really when stereotypes and stigma started to emerge. And discrimination kind of started there, and it continued up until the Industrial Revolution, where we see a change. They lived in the outskirts, but it wasn't until the 18th century when jobs were brought into the mainstream cities, Roma started moving into the mainstream cities and participating in society. So this is one of the key events in history where we see Roma starting to integrate more into society and participate with Hungarians. And then, discrimination and negative representations carried on even up until the 20th century. And we see this during World War II and the Romani Holocaust that isn't talked about as much, also known as Barajmos, where discrimination, and because they were seen as racially inferior, they were persecuted, and mass executions occurred for them. But again, even till today, it's not discussed as much as Jewish persecution that happened during World War II. The second event that we can really see is that changed the perception, or the changed integration of Roma in Hungary, was the increase of living standards under communism. So when Soviet Union came in and liberated Hungary from German forces, essentially, they also brought this regime of communism, and under communism, nationalism was much less important. And so it didn't matter to them whether you were Hungarian, it didn't matter to them whether you were Roma, it didn't matter if you were Jewish, it mattered a little bit if you were German, but essentially it didn't matter your ethnic background. You were an equal member of the state, and you were seen as equal. And under communism, jobs, employment was obligated, so was schooling, housing was provided. And so this is really when we see the first time where the Roma population was able to obtain standard living wages, and their children were attaining education, and living standards increased. This is significant because as living standards increased, we also saw a decrease in discrimination, and so there's a correlation there. But it is fair to mention that just because the state says that everyone's equal doesn't mean that discrimination automatically goes away. So it was still there, but it was just silenced for a little while. But while that was happening, living standards also raised, integration of Roma people in society also raised. And then the next big shift that happened was the collapse of the communist system, and this happened between 1989 and 1991. And this transition to a capitalist system left a lot of countries in recession. The economic situation was extremely tough, and we saw a big shift in labor demands. So unskilled labor was no longer necessary, and this highly affected the Roma population because they tended to be less educated and didn't have the skills necessary for the jobs that were out there. So this affected them tremendously and disproportionately. And this is where another stigmas started coming, as they were lazy, they didn't have jobs, they lived in again, housing that wasn't adequate or sustainable. But one question that one observation that we made while there is that we realized the effect that this had on younger generations, where so younger generations that grew up during this transition, they grew up in this environment where their parents didn't have jobs, they didn't attain high education, and they lived in lower, segregated communities, and so this became the norm for them. And so it's kind of fair to say this wasn't the case for everybody, but there was almost a loss of work ethic, or it was less emphasized. Going to school wasn't as stressed enough, or obtaining a high job of a high degree wasn't stressed enough. And so the big thing we can take away from here is that during the Soviet era, we saw that there was that these gaps of inequalities were able to be closed. They shrunk, and as those shrunk, we saw a decrease in discrimination as well. And so this happened before. How can we make these gaps close again? How can we do this again? One of the most important ways is through education. That's why there's so many projects focused around it. And so these are statistics I gathered from 2011 consensus on the education attainment of Roma population compared to the Hungarian attainment of education. And we can see that these numbers are incredibly, they contrast each other very much, and where 40% of Roma population almost didn't even complete primary education, which is the mandatory amount. So basically, I would say like kindergarten, first grade through 8th grade. And so they don't even achieve primary education, whereas that's only 18% of the Hungarian population didn't achieve that. And so the next one is 8th grade, so that's where they did complete the primary education, which is only 39% of the Roma compared to 23% of the Hungarians. And then the next one is vocational, also known as like a technical school, a technical degree. So this, only 8% of Roma have achieved this many, like a vocational degree, compared to 18%. And this, even just a vocational degree will put you so much more ahead in getting a higher paying job. And this is where the differences become really drastic, is secondary schooling. So it's essentially like high school, which is not mandatory. And this is where you see a big drastic change where only 3% of Roma are completing high school, essentially, or secondary education, compared to 1/4, or a quarter of the Hungarian population. And then, even more significant is the attainment of university degrees or college degrees, where less than 1% of the Roma population obtain a higher education degree compared to 14% of the Hungarian population. And so we want to ask the question, like, what is causing these significant changes, these low numbers of Roma education attainment? So this is where we look at the challenges that Romani students face, and why is it difficult for them to continue to school? Why aren't they achieving higher education like the Hungarians? And so a big thing from the start of their educational careers is the segregation of schools. And this can be seen like widespread all over Hungary. Sometimes there is segregation within classrooms, where there's classrooms specific for Roma students. Sometimes there's buildings within schools that are specific for Roma students. And even schools themselves can be not exclusive, but tend to have a majority of Roma population that also reflect housing segregation. And so the big point with this is that if they're tended to be designated towards Roma students, they also tend to have a lower quality of education being provided. So right from the get-go, they're being provided a lower quality of education in comparison to non-Roma. But it's also something to be said about the state schooling system, where maybe there's a lack of exposure to each ethnic group. And so focusing on like early childhood education and diversity and sensitivity training might have an impact on how other students, learn and are more aware of the Roma culture to fight any discriminations or biases they may have. Nextly is the family discouragement. So students will sometimes not pursue higher education because their families never did. They would be faced, well, why are you picking your studies and books over your family and providing for your family and your community and being part of the whole? So, as a 13-year-old, being excluded from your community and your one sense of home is a big challenge to face. And lastly, penultimately, is the limited scholarships for higher education. And so we went to the University of Page and we talked to some students in the romology department where they expressed that scholarships are very limited and they, very competitive to obtain or to get, to receive. And if you do receive them, it's for a very little amount. And so higher education there, it's difficult, it's expensive. I guess we can all understand that to a certain degree. And so if you don't have the means or funding, you're less likely to even have that idea of going and getting a diploma. And lastly, I wanted to talk about this poverty trap that I kind of identified. And so this happens when, poor economic situation or where your family is in causes students to not pursue higher education or secondary schooling. And this leads to them getting a low-paying job and a wage, which doesn't allow them to break the cycle. So they're not able to increase their living standards because they have this low-paying job. And this happens when, per se, as an example of a case that we learned, there was a student in, I believe it was Page, where her name was Donatella. She went to a school I will be talking about shortly, and she was a really good student. She had really good English. She applied for a summer program abroad, and it was a lot of work, many applications, and she was helped with many teachers and programs. And she got the job, and she got the program. She received it, and she was really happy, and she wanted to be a lawyer, and she expressed it. She was a great student. But then her mom wanted her to go to Austria and serve and be a waitress to have money because they needed money. And Donatella, being a young 15-year-old girl, she wanted to be a good daughter and she wanted to provide for her family. And so instead of going and pursuing programs or educations that's going to benefit her in the long run, she has this moral obligation to go and provide for her family and work. And so she ended up having to go to Austria and serve. And so it's, she wasn't able to break out of the cycle of poverty trap. And that's okay, and that's understandable, because when you're young, when you're 13, 14, 15, and your parents are lacking food and services, and you have to provide for them instead of going to study, they see, instead of spending 3 or 4 years studying, you can just go work now and have money and provide. And so it creates this poverty trap. And the only way to break it really is to achieve higher education that'll provide a higher paying job where you can you have mobility within the social classes and raise living standards. And so this goes to the next slide, where this is a school that focuses on breaking this poverty cycle. So this is one of the education projects we focused on, called Gandhi High School. This was located in Page. And before getting too much into it, during the 1990s, after the transition of the collapse of the communist system, there's a lot of emphasis on organizations creating schools that focused around a Romani population or Romani culture. This emphasis on Roma culture also provides them with a good sense of identity and community. They are able to learn about their roots. They're able to be proud of their identity. They don't feel like they have to leave their Roma identity to gain power in the system, essentially. And so it gives them a good sense of community. And it also surrounds them with students that grew up in similar economic and housing situations. And so when they're able to relate to several students that are in the same boat and they're all trying to achieve the same goal, it gives them a good sense of direction and encouragement that sometimes they don't receive outside of the school. So Gandhi School operates as a boarding school where students go during the week, and then during the weekends they go back home. But they're pretty strict on attendance, exams to get in, their studies. They have a zero drug policy, and they really expect students to devote themselves completely to their education. The big impact they make here in intervening into that poverty cycle is that they actually give students allowances. So they're essentially paying students, Romani students, to go there. And so they're providing that money and funds that would be like an extra burden off their shoulders so they can devote themselves to education. They don't have to worry about providing or working for their families. So they can focus primarily on that. But this allowance, it's difficult because they don't really manage how a student spends it. But I guess the positive effects is that they also allow students to develop skills of managing money. And so in 2000, the first class in 1994 was composed of 56 students. In 2000, 18% of those original 56 students graduated, which is a 34% rate of graduation, which is comparatively a lot higher than the overall Roma population that completes secondary schooling. But it's still, 18 out of 56, that's still yielding a low result for the amount of money that's being directed towards this program. And so when we went and we talked to faculty and administration there, which we got to do, we learned that there was a 25% rate of graduation now. They didn't give us any specific statistics, and you can't really find any online. I really searched for them, but they said it was 25%, which is even like a decrease from 34%. There's so much money being allocated here, you have to ask, are these resources being used to their full extent? And so that leads me into the improper allocation of money that might be being used. And so we got to, my peers and I, we were privileged enough to go to the school, and we met with faculty and administration. We got a walk through the school, and it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. Unfortunately, we weren't able to speak with any students because it was summer and it had just let out and we just barely missed them. But and the school is massive, it's huge, it's very modern, a great institution. But then we were also brought into this massive gymnasium, which is pictured here. And sometimes you have to question, how often do 150 students use the gymnasium, where they have to constantly maintain it, change the floors, and you play sports. It's just for 150 students. You have to question, is it being used properly? And it's not. And sometimes they have to rent this location out to many to make a profit. We were also taken to a production studio that had the latest equipment. It was very high tech. It was really nice. But when you have 150 students, I'm sure there's a small percentage of those students that actually use it for music production. And so there's the money being allocated to a lot of extracurricular activities. But as we were doing a walkthrough, we also were talking to some teachers, and they said, well, I don't know, I wish the classrooms were bigger. We had more space, and we're missing some textbooks, some books, some other supplies. And so, they have money to spend on like audio production. Why can't they invest some money on more textbooks or expanding the classroom? So we have to question, like, are these resources being used to their full extent? Because right now they're only 25% of the classes are graduating. If so much money is being directed towards other stuff, why can't it be directed towards books? It's something that's going to increase that graduation rate. Lastly, little conclusion. The importance of education is that higher education will allow the Roma population to obtain higher paying jobs and be competitive in the labor market. And if their competitive labor market get higher paying jobs, they're able to they're able to raise their living standards and housing, and so this whole new cycle is recreated, and slowly will raise the entire minority up bit by bit by really just education, investing in education. And so my suggestions for improvement is, again, like I just talked about, put money in where it matters most, and that goes into after school programs. It could be into providing more books, spaces for classrooms, not necessarily getting the latest instrument, but putting money where it needs to be. Also introducing cultural sensitivity training in early childhood education, ECE, and this will expose students on both sides of the scale or of the discourse of being culturally sensitive and diverse to other cultures and being more tolerant towards others. And this is not just one-sided argument where Hungarians need to accept the Roma culture. It's on both sides where Romas also need to engage in discourse and talk with Hungarian society and just be more accepting. And this starts from early childhood education. And lastly is that increase in scholarships available for students. So making room for the Roma in education, higher education, and providing more scholarships that will motivate them to seek a higher degree. And things to look for in the future is the funding from EU currently. A lot of programs are being funded by EU money, which is subject to change, and I believe 2020 or the following years, depending on how much development or increase or decrease in social inequalities occurs in the closing of gaps. So it'll be interesting because a lot of that program money is education program monies comes from like the EU. So there's changes to it. What can we expect to see, and how is it going to affect those education projects? And lastly, I want to leave you guys with difficulty or the question of integration. Integration is an extremely difficult thing to measure. Sometimes people say it's based on language, it's based on traditions, customs you follow. But if we're talking about the Roma, they're a population that have lived here in Hungary for 500 years. They speak the language. They have Hungarian passports. They were born there. To what measure do we want to integrate them? Like, how ethical is it? Do we want them to leave their cultures completely? Do we want them to? Does the state want them to leave their traditions behind? Do they want them to fully assimilate? So it's this question of integration that we always have to be asking. Like, how are we going to measure it? How is the success of it going to be measured? And so with that, I will lead to any questions that I or my peers could answer.